Hello, I'm Adam Smith and I am a type 1 diabetic. Today I'm at the beautiful Tottenham Hotspur training ground with AIA for a Rethink Healthy Diabetes special chat with three very special people. Let's go and meet him. First up, a man that needs no introduction. He is a Spurs legend, is Gary Mabbutt. Gary, great to have you alongside us.
Thank you very much. Great to be here.
Yeah, and alongside you, Andre Hermans, who is an AIA expert. Andre, you're going to be delving deep into the world of diabetes. So again, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
And alongside him, Panos Markakis, who is, of course, Spurs nutritionist. Right, I think there's so much to talk about. We've obviously, Gary, we share a lot. We're both type 1 diabetics. Andre, you're a type 2 diabetic. So I think it's probably worth starting with a very basic discussion about what diabetes is and, of course, the difference between those two types.
Sure. I mean, diabetes is such a complex disease, but I think I'll try and keep it as simple as possible because we can break it down into maybe three areas.
Yeah.
The first one and the most serious one is type 1 diabetes, which is anybody who needs insulin to keep control. So that's mostly the people that don't produce insulin, the true type 1 diabetics. But some of the type 2 diabetics need insulin because they can't be controlled well, and so they will also have insulin. And then the type 2 diabetics who are on a medication are less serious, they're sort of called major. And then there's the gestational diabetes, or the people that have diabetes, ladies when they're giving birth and are in gestation period, they become diabetic but then lose it again. And then there's the pre-diabetics, who are people who are susceptible for diabetes and so on. And then there's the healthy people. But the type 1 diabetic is the body does not produce any insulin.
Yeah.
Type 2 diabetes is they are producing insulin, but it's not being effectively used. So either the insulin is not effective or the body's not using it effectively.
Gary, if you don't mind me asking, can I ask about your diagnosis story? Because you famously played Premier League football, you played for England, you lifted the FA Cup as a type 1 diabetic. You are an inspiration to many type 1 diabetics, including myself. When did you find out you were a type 1 diabetic and that sort of diagnosis period for you?
Well, it's great to hear Andre talking about all the different types of diabetes. Of course, obviously, I'm very well versed in it now, having been a diabetic now for 45 years.
Wow.
And I was a professional footballer at Bristol Rovers. I went to grammar school in Bristol, and then after my O-levels, I then went on to an apprenticeship in football. And I was at Bristol Rovers, I was 17 years of age. I was in the first team, and New Year's Day we played away at Leicester. Now, in the few days up to that, just after Christmas, I complained to our physios that, look, I'm not feeling great. I'm drinking a lot, but I'm not feeling great. They said, well, they thought I'd been out like on the booze over Christmas.
Yeah, Christmas.
Having a few drinks and you're thirsty, and everyone, the other lads come in after a few nights out, they have a few, crack, we need a lot of water today.
Yeah.
They thought it was to do with that.
Yeah.
Of course, it wasn't. So I played at Leicester, and I had the worst game I've ever had in professional football.
Wow.
I felt terrible. My energy low, I was very low, I was lethargic. We lost 3-0. On the way back on the coach, the manager came to me and said, Gary, look, you're terrible today. What's the problem? I said, look, I'm not feeling great. I've mentioned it before. I said, look, when we get back to Bristol, we'll go and see the club doctor. Back to Bristol, saw the club doctor. Within 10 minutes, said, Gary, you're a diabetic. And they said, but Gary, the most important thing we've got to tell you is that you'll never be able to play football again.
Wow. They categorically said that you'd never be a footballer again.
We spoke to 3 of the top specialists in the world on diabetes and in sport, and said it'd be impossible to manage your condition as a professional sportsman. No one's ever done it from a young age before. We took some more advice, and a gentleman in London I think it was at St Bart's.
Yeah.
And he said, look, Gary, obviously I heard about the situation, and it's not happened before, but if you're determined, I'm prepared to back you and see what can be done.
Because Andre, you're type 2 diabetic, so your diagnosis story, I imagine, is quite different to what Gary and my diagnosis story was. Can you tell us a bit about your story?
Yeah, really different. I mean, I was fascinated with Gary's story because it just shows how things have evolved over time and the complexity of the disease. And I think it really epitomizes what people think when they hear about a diabetic. They think exactly your story, how complicated it is, all the testing you have to do, all that kind of stuff. And I think it has a stigma to it, and there's not necessarily a need for the stigma to diabetes. I'm South African. I did my military service. I extended my military service, did 4 years. Obviously, I was not a diabetic, very healthy, very fit. Started getting a pain in my foot. And it got so bad I couldn't walk, and ended up going to the doctor, and the doctor said, you've got gout. Right. And my wife said, you need to stop drinking red wine.
Okay.
Anyway, it didn't go away. Of course, I stopped drinking red wine, but it didn't go away. And then went back to the doctor, and he did this blood test, and he found my glucose was really sky high. And my triglycerides were sky high, which is one of the lipids, and they're normally associated because the triglycerides are kind of catabolized by the liver. And put me on all of these drugs and whatever, and also the same kind of thing, testing. But fortunately, even though I'm older than you, Kerry, the testing, they did say do blood tests as you go along. And I could not get under control. And they were seriously thinking about putting me onto insulin.
So even though, I think that's an important point, just to reiterate, even though you're type 2,
Yes.
it is common for some type 2s to be on insulin, and that was common for your doctor to say that to you at the time, that insulin was an option for you to manage your levels.
It was. And quite interestingly enough, he said, I'll give you insulin because I can't control your glucose with tablets. As it turns out now, in those days, he could have done an insulin test, which would have said clearly whether you're a diabetic or not a diabetic, because type 1 diabetes don't have insulin, type 2 do have insulin, it's just that they're not using it enough. So he didn't do that, but changed the medication and sort of got it under control. But the control is very iffy. You know, it's a lot to do with your diet, the carbs you eat, if you're drinking alcohol, if you're doing exercise, if you manage your weight, all that kind of stuff is very, very subjective for type 2 compared to type 1. It's taken a long time to get to a point where I actually understand the disease. Yeah. And I think it's the understanding, and a lot about the stigma. You know, don't tell anybody you're diabetic, don't go and check up, all of those kind of things. I think there's a lot of stuff around that. So I think people don't know if they're diabetic, if they have a normal lifestyle. It's the people that have not got a regular lifestyle, that are not managing themselves well, that should really be aware. Because sometimes diabetes is so insidious, you can have everything, and if you're not producing insulin, you'll become a diabetic. People need to get checked up.
I think that's a really important point. It brings us nicely to you, Panos. Now, I know that there aren't type 1 diabetics at Spurs currently, but do you have, similar to Gary's situation, where if a player says they don't feel right, will you always do full checkups on players straight away? Because there's so many conditions, there's such complexities with the human body, and obviously you're dealing with superstars as well that play in the Premier League. So is it something you're overly cautious on now if a player presents something slightly abnormal with regards to their physical health?
Yeah, correct. I think especially nowadays it's just like, let's see what's going on.
Right.
So a blood test could be taken in the next hour, for example, or 2 hours, and then it can determine everything. So to answer your question, yes, anytime that the player says, listen, something's not right with me, we always refer them for a blood test. And
Well, Smithy, you've asked some great questions so far, all of us, but obviously, come back to yourself. You're a type 1 diabetic. How did you become diabetic?
Yeah, it was quite a strange story, Mark. I don't know if it's unique or different, but I was, it would have been 10 years ago, so I would have been, how old would I have been there? Late 20s, very late 20s, 29, that sort of age I was, which is quite rare to get type 1, as we sort of pointed out earlier. Very ill. Bizarrely, I actually had a bout of food poisoning 6 months earlier, and my GP said, let's give him full blood tests at the time just to check everything, because we didn't know what was wrong with me. And I remember they did my blood sugar then, it was absolutely perfect. So I knew that I wasn't diabetic at that stage. Anyway, fast forward 6 months, and I think the symptoms are really important to point out, because I think they're the same that you had, but I mean, an unquenchable thirst where you're drinking gallons of water, going to the toilet every hour during the night. Went into hospital for an appointment because I didn't feel well, and they checked my blood sugar on a finger prick, and it was 34 or something. And then the next reading, it just said high. And I said, sorry, why is there not a number there? And they said, oh, the monitor doesn't record anything over 34. And it's important to point out that a non-diabetic's blood sugar will tend to be between 4 to 6, but can go to 7, 8 if they've had a high glucose meal. So I was off the scale, straight into an ambulance, blue lit to hospital. I do remember the paramedic saying to me, we need to get you to hospital because you're a week away from a coma. And they said, you're diabetic. I said, what does that mean? You need to take insulin. I said, how often? They said, every day. I said, how many times? They said, at least 5 times a day. And I was like, okay. And I said, what happens if I don't? And they said, well, you won't survive. So I remember just thinking, wow, this is a complete lifestyle change. Left the hospital, and then you're just left to deal with everything. Please be open about your condition, because I always thought if there's anything that's slightly against the norm, people will judge you. And when you're on a tube and you're getting a needle out and injecting, I still get it now. You do see people that look at you slightly differently. I don't really care now because I'm that far down. But at the stage that I got diagnosed, I had a huge issue with my mental health. I had dreadful anxiety. I saw specialists, therapists. I'm not afraid to admit that, and it was great for me because it was at such a poignant part of my career, and I had this sort of hammer blow to my health that I thought at the time, by hiding it would help me, which was completely wrong. I also thought there might be a stigma, people might judge me because I'm doing something a bit differently. And what I actually found was the exact opposite. When I went through 2 years really of keeping the condition hidden, 2 years of being up at night, seeing a therapist, being in a dreadful place with my mental health, when I finally told people and when I opened up on social media, the reaction was overwhelmingly positive. Yeah. And I got so many messages from parents of kids that suffer, and it made me think, wow, it was like a light bulb, probably the biggest light bulb moment I've had in my life, that actually this is something that's actually can be used as a gift, that I want to use my profile to help others going through it. So now I'm the total opposite. At any given moment that I talk about it. I just didn't want it to prevent me achieving anything.
If you're diabetic, don't let diabetes lead your life.
And I want to just echo what Gary said as well on that. I think it's a really important point you make about it cannot stop you doing what you want to do. In most scenarios, it will not stop you living your dream. And I echo exactly that.